Hey all, welcome back to my Parkinson series. Today we're on part 3, and in this installation we're going to be focusing on two topics: the pathophysiology of Parkinson's, which is how it works in the body, and the course of disease, which is how you can expect it to progress upon development. Up to this point in the series, we have discussed what Parkinson's is, genetic and environmental factors that can increase a person's risk of developing the disease, how prevalent it is, and we've even taken a look at some famous figures that have received a diagnosis of Parkinson's. But how does this disease actually work? It's time to talk about the pathophysiology of PD. This part is a bit complicated, so I drew a diagram that will hopefully help make the information a little more concrete by giving you a visual to attach it to. In people with Parkinson's disease, the manifestations can more or less be tracked all the way down to the substantia nigra of the basal ganglia. When the cerebral cortex decides to initiate a movement, it is run through the basal ganglia to basically fine-tune it and make sure it comes out properly. The signal goes from the cerebral cortex into the caudate striatum, through to the globus pallidus pathways, to the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends the input back to the motor cortex to be sent out of the brain into the rest of the body. One of the modulating neurotransmitters in the whole process is dopamine, which is produced in a portion of the basal ganglia called the substantia nigra. In Parkinson's disease, the neurons that produce the dopamine begin to break down, as does the nigrostriatum, which is the axonal bridge the substantia nigra uses to send dopamine to the caudate striatum. Usually the dopamine would then attach to D1 and D2 receptors in the striatum. The D1 receptors would cause the release of GABA into the globus pallidus interna, which would then inhibit the release of GABA into the thalamus. GABA being released in the thalamus suppresses thalamic activity. At the same time, dopamine binding to D2 receptors inhibits the release of GABA into the globus pallidus externa, which would have inhibited the release of GABA into the subthalamic nucleus if it had been released. Since that doesn't happen, GABA is released into the subthalamic nucleus after all, which then inhibits the release of glutamate from the subthalamic nucleus into the globus pallidus interna. If the glutamate were released, it would stimulate the production of GABA into the thalamus. So long story short, the loss of dopamine supply causes a big uptick in GABA secretion into the thalamus, which then suppresses the thalamic signals that would be sent back to the motor cortex, fine-tuning and regulating movement. If you've ever heard of gabapentin, you might have a better understanding of what GABA does in the brain. It's a suppressor. So if this explanation with diagram is still confusing, think of it this way. If the GABA, the purple, gets released into a section of the brain, it inhibits that section of the brain from doing whatever it would usually do. The blue, glutamate, does the opposite. Now for some information about the course of Parkinson's, or in other words how it progresses over time once the disease begins. One interesting feature about Parkinson's disease is that different people have different symptoms at different times throughout the disease course. As a result, it is difficult to map out the course of disease that a person with Parkinson's can be expected to follow. The motor symptoms of PD get a lot of attention, but there are also non-motor symptoms, including depression and impaired cognition. Although one thing that cases usually have in common is diagnosis due to onset of motor symptoms, which usually start unilaterally but eventually progress to presenting bilaterally, it is possible that the person had personality-related manifestations of Parkinson's for some time before motor symptoms tipped them or anyone else off. Because the course of disease is variable, it is instead useful to use Hone and Yar's 5 stages to measure the progression of Parkinson's disease. As the case progresses through the stages, more symptoms begin to appear and symptoms become more severe. In the first and second stages, the disease may go undetected with little to no symptoms. Motor symptoms and impact to quality of life in general may be relatively mild. By stages 4 and 5, however, the impact of PD is more substantial. Cases may develop dementia, and they are likely at an increased risk of falls due to changes in gait and posture. Autonomic symptoms may appear as well, impacting things like sleep-wake cycles, and even resulting in impotence in some cases. Alright everybody, thanks for tuning in to watch episode 3 of my Parkinson series. We talked about the pathophysiology and the course of the disease today. In the next installation in this series, we're going to talk about the manifestations, or in other words, the symptoms of Parkinson's, and then the labs and diagnostics, how you can figure out whether somebody has Parkinson's, and finally, pharmacological treatments, so medications that you can give somebody to help them with their Parkinson's. If you liked the video, do me a favor and tell one person in real life other than myself that you enjoyed the video so that they go watch it. See you soon, have a good day, and thanks for tuning in.